Hello, my name is Dr. Dan Barnett, and I'm from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today, as part of the OHCQ Leadership Development Series, I'm going to be talking about a really critical topic, which is communicating challenging news in writing. Given the role of OHCQ, this is part of what you do. And the goal of today's presentation is to describe practical tools and strategies to enhance your ability to communicate effectively in writing difficult to deliver news. Here are the learning objectives for this presentation. I'm going to talk about and ask for you to be able to describe afterwards the 10 rules of communicating unfavorable news in professional writing. Discuss how these 10 rules may apply to your professional writing at OHCQ. Define the concept of negative dominance, which is a very important consideration in this context, and its relevance to communicating difficult news in writing. And lastly, describe potential approaches for more effective delivery of unfavorable news in writing in the context of your work. So as you well know, at OHCQ, you often have to deliver very difficult news to stakeholders. And there is an art and a science of this. And we're going to kind of bridge those two in today's presentation. Before going into strategies and suggestions, I'd like to start out with some opening discussion questions for you to consider. First of all, what types of writing do you do in your work at OHCQ? Secondly, what types of difficult news do you need to convey in your written work at OHCQ? Based on those discussion considerations, I'm going to talk about 10 principles for delivering difficult news in writing, adapted from Robert Bees from Georgetown University, and here's the link to a related article in Forbes. And we'll talk about each of these principles in turn. Now, as a caveat, before I go into these principles, I want to mention that some principles may be easier to adhere to than others, but to the extent possible, it's really essential and is a benefit to you and your stakeholders to try to adhere to these principles as much as you can in your writing. So the first principle for communicating difficult news in writing is to avoid or at least minimize surprising your readers. That may be feasible in some cases, it may not be, but the less things come as a surprise to your readers when you deliver difficult news in your work at OHCQ, the more effective the outcomes will be for all parties. Principle number 9 is avoid or minimize delay. If there is bad news to deliver, to the extent that you can avoid sitting on that bad news, please avoid doing that. That really helps with transparency, frankly, and trust. If it ever comes to light that bad news was sat upon before delivery, that can have untoward consequences as well. So again, to the extent possible, avoid or minimize delay. Having said that, when communicating bad news in writing, a key theme overall is the axiom measure twice and cut once in terms of adhering to each of these principles. Think about how you want to approach it before you deliver that difficult news. Principle number 8 is never downplay the facts. It's important to acknowledge the difficult news that's the content of your writing when it is about difficult news. It doesn't serve anyone to minimize or diminish the importance of that difficult news. Ultimately, as an agency that's very involved in regulatory activities, as you well know, facts are critical in terms of documentation, for legal reasons and otherwise in your work with your stakeholders in regulating their activities. So please don't downplay the facts. Please always put things in writing. I think I'm speaking to the choir on this one, but documentation is absolutely critical in any medical legal context, and of course OHCQ is absolutely no exception to that. Again, putting things in writing is important as well because it minimizes confusion. When we think about the game telephone, for example, person A communicating to person B, communicating to person C verbally, sometimes the message can get lost in translation by the time it reaches person D, for example. So for a variety of reasons, written documentation is absolutely critical, and that's why I'm highlighting it as a training item here. Principle number 6 is very important. Just as important as documentation, it's important to justify the reason for the difficult news that you're conveying. This is not the same as defensiveness. Rather, it is highlighting for constructive purposes for your stakeholders why you've implemented the regulatory action that you've implemented, for example. So justification is a critical piece of that concept. Now, principle number 5 is the concept of seeking silver linings, meaning that if you're conveying difficult news about a regulatory action that you're taking toward a stakeholder, if or as applicable, try to incorporate in that message why this is something that's important and why and how it may benefit ultimately and will benefit ultimately the stakeholder entity. This is not the same as spin. It may sound like spin to think about silver linings or coupling your negative messages or difficult to deliver messages with positive elements, but actually it improves the uptake and the level of sort of comfort and cohesion of your stakeholders with you as an agency. It's important that you work together ultimately, even if you are a regulatory agency, that you work together with your stakeholders. So highlighting silver linings when appropriate is important. Bringing solutions. So punitive elements obviously are a critical piece of any kind of regulation, but coupling that with solutions when feasible and appropriate offers a very constructive way to communicate difficult news in writing that makes it more than just about the negative. I'd like to briefly mention about negative dominance in this context. So anytime you communicate difficult news or any negative message, it carries more weight in people's mind. How many times, for example, have you received 99 compliments and 1 insult? What do you remember longer? Usually it's the insult. And the reason for that is this concept of negative dominance. So it's important to keep in mind as leaders at OHCQ that when you're communicating difficult news in writing to your stakeholders, what your stakeholders will primarily remember is the negative components of the message, whether it's the action that's being taken as part of regulation or other. But coupling that with solutions allows you to soften some of that negative dominance by making it positive and solution-oriented to the extent possible. It's important also, and this is principle number 3, to remember your multiple audiences. So whenever you're communicating anything in writing, you really have 2 different sets of audiences at the very least. Your internal stakeholders within OHCQ and your external stakeholders. Those can be obviously hospitals and other healthcare entities, but those external stakeholders have themselves varied stakeholders among them. They may be hospital administrators, they may be specific providers. So keeping in mind your multiple audiences can allow you to tailor your messages, your written messages accordingly in communicating difficult news. Very importantly, and I know this is what you do already, but I'm saying this for emphasis, is to, of course, follow up and follow through when communicating difficult news in writing. Monitoring programs that are being reviewed or sanctioned for violations, for example, is an example of following up and following through. So these are kinds of considerations that need to be part of the flow of messages, written messages that involve negative content. And last but not least, and I know that you do this already, but I just want to highlight this out of due diligence, is to always treat your readers with respect and dignity. For example, we'll talk in another session about communicating difficult news verbally, but when communicating in writing, there are ways of saying the same thing in a more constructive and positive tone versus a negative, exclusively harsh tone. And we'll talk about that momentarily as well. So for additional practical considerations, I highly recommend a site called the Purdue Online Writing Lab, or Purdue OWL, which is available at this URL. And we'll talk more at this time about some other factors for your writing in communicating difficult news. So in negative message writing, for example, in denying a request, as a hypothetical example, these are examples of how to treat your reader with respect and dignity, and frankly, enhance their level of uptake and reduce the level of potential discord. So if you were denying someone a request, let's say one of your subordinates requested a 1-month vacation. I'm just making this up as an example. It's not the best to write your response as follows. Your request for a 1-month vacation is denied. It sounds a little bit cold, harsh, and a little bit insensitive. You can say the same thing in a much more cordial way, but still equally effective. So here's an example. Thank you for your vacation request. However, the agency cannot accommodate a vacation request of that duration due to critical workflow considerations. Do you see how this second example allows for delivery of the same negative content, if you will, denial of a request, but in a much more acceptable way that respects the reader? So tone is very important. Here's another example. Let's use as an illustrative example addressing faults or issues concerning an individual. I would respectfully discourage writing the following. I do not understand why you have failed to submit the required forms on time. Instead, an alternative way to phrase that, but just as effective, is missing deadlines for completion of required forms is not acceptable in this organization. You're saying the same thing, but it's less ad hominem, and frankly will be more likely responded to constructively in the second example on this slide. So as we discussed, communicating difficult news in writing is obviously a centerpiece of what you do and are required to do as an agency at OHCQ. I hope that these concepts and suggestions have given you insights into how you can constantly improve and tailor your difficult written communication in constructive ways that help your agency and its many stakeholders. Thank you.